Alright, in this section we're going to get our player shooting. It's important to note, up till now we've been using images from the resources folder that I put up for you on Blackboard's site, but it's easy enough to create a bullet image, and I want to give you a little practice creating an image from scratch. So let's do that now. So we're going to go in and create a new sprite. We'll call this one S bullet. And we're going to set the size by scaling the image, or I guess we can scale the canvas since we haven't started drawing yet. Let's scale the canvas, and let's make the width 36, and we'll make the height 18. Okay, 36 by 18, and hit apply. And then if you look out into your picture here, it's tiny, so you can click on the center fit to blow that up. We're going to move the origin point of the image to middle center. Then click on Edit Image, and we'll come into the sprite editor, and we'll start to play around a little bit with this. Let me adjust the size here as well. Maybe I'll shrink it down, make it a little easier to work with without interfering with my toolbar. Alright, we're going to have a 2-frame bullet image, sort of like our player jumping image, where we had a jumping up image and a jumping down image. For our bullet, the first frame, frame 0, is going to be just a flash. When the bullet is fired, it's going to create a brief flash, and then the second image, frame 1, is going to be the actual bullet. So I might as well create 2 frames right now. We'll select the first frame, and for our flash, you can either just grab a big old circle, and if you look up at the menu, you can see that you are able here to set the size. So maybe what I'll do on the size is I'm going to set this by 18 so it matches the size of our sprite itself. And now you see when I put it out and sort of center it out in the middle of the screen, then it's essentially being right where we want it to be. And that, place it out in the middle, click, and that's it. Now I've got my first frame done. Let's go to the second frame, and for the second frame we're going to draw out a bullet. Now this doesn't have to be amazingly pretty. You can sort of make it work however you like. So draw yourself a bullet. The main idea is to make it look roughly like this. Doesn't have to be exactly like this. You can play around with it as you like. But that should work. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that. One thing I do want to mess with is if you are in the image editor here, you'll see that inside the image editor you can set the speed at which this animated image will animate. In the old version of GameMaker, just in case any of you are using 1 point something, there was a similar feature where you could set the speed, but that speed was only for within the editor, just to see what an animation would look like at different speeds. That has changed in the newer version of GameMaker we're using for class, where this actually will set the speed of the animation for this image. And for our bullet, we're going to jump that speed way up to 60. And the idea is that we just want to briefly show the first frame and then of the flash of the firing of the bullet, and then switch almost immediately, instantly almost, to the second frame, and then we'll hold on that second frame. Alright. So we've got our very first creation of our own sprite that we made. Sweet. Okay, so now that we've drawn our very first image, let's create the bullet itself. For creating objects, you know the drill by now. Right-click in the workspace, choose Create Object. We'll call this one Bullet. We will select the bullet sprite that we just created. Thank you. Mine's complaining because it says I've already created a bullet. It's because I have in the background, but I'm going to get rid of that one. Okay. Now on our bullet, we want to, we've played with objects that are like this bullet in the Evil Clutches game with the baby dragons, the evil babies, the health packs, all of these kinds of objects that we instantiated in the game and then had perform some actions when they are instantiated, mainly moving in a certain direction and maybe playing a sound. We're going to set it up a little bit differently in this game in that we're going to control the movement and the speed of our bullet from the player rather than from within the bullet. But we will do some setup here within the bullet itself. Namely, we want on our creation of an instance of the bullet, we'll play a firing sound here from within the bullet. Right now we only have one sound in the project, just the click sound. Do we even have a click sound? I don't think you may even have that yet. Well, we need to bring in a whole bunch of sounds in here. So I brought in one following the old school way where we hit resources and create sound and then choose the sound that you want. That's how we got our click sound that I've got here that you probably don't have in yours. Let's bring in all the rest of the sounds all at once to save time later. So remember that you can do this if you go into the resources folder for the project and then go into the sounds folder. You'll see a list of all of the sounds that are in there. Now in my case, like I said, I'd already brought in the click sound, but I can bring in all the rest by selecting all of them and then just dragging them over. And in doing so, it will automatically give them the name that they have in the original file, which is the name that we want. I can bring in the bonus sound as well. And very rapidly then, without having to do any real work, we now have all of the sounds that we're going to need inside the game. Now, of course, you can do this exact same thing with the sprites, but because I want to focus some attention on each of the sprites and objects, I'll bring them in one at a time. All right, so now we're back to our bullet. Let's have a create event. And in the create event, all we're going to do is play the sound. So we'll do audio, sound. Oh, if I can type correctly, play. If I can do this right. Hello. Audio play. There we go. Audio play sound. And we tell it the sound we want to play in this case, which is going to be SN shot with a priority of 10 and false meaning don't loop. And all we're going to do in the create event is that. We're not going to set the direction. We're not going to set the speed. As I said, we're going to do that later from within the player. For a couple of reasons. One is that's how Sean Spalding did it in his elaborate collection of tutorials that I want you to be able to use if you want to go more deeply into a platformer without having a lot of trouble. So I'm following his approach. And then there are some other more meaningful reasons that I'll get into when we set this thing up inside our player. Another thing we want to do here within the bullet is we want to detect if a bullet hits the wall or the floor out in the room, and if so, we want to then destroy the bullet. To do that, we would use the same thing we've used a zillion times, which is the place meeting, when we would check if the bullet were to run into the wall, then destroy the bullet. And we can use place meeting for that. Up until this point, we've used the step event, which we could use here. But I'm going to do a slightly different version of the step event in that I'm going to use begin step. Begin step is just something that happens every step of the game, but it happens just before the step event. And by setting up this detection to see if we're going to have a collision between the bullet and the wall here in the begin step, it functions exactly the same way as the step event, but visually it gives a different kind of effect in that it allows it to look as if the bullet has sort of intersected with the wall visually before it's destroyed. Where if we put it in a regular step event, it effectively gets rid of the image sooner, even though that seems illogical since it's being detected slightly later than the begin step. But regardless, take a look and see what this looks like. So we'll say if place meeting, And what are we checking for? Well, we're going to check if in our current position, wherever the bullet is at the moment, we're detecting right as we're hitting the wall, and so we want to check to see if we're hitting the wall. So if place meeting is right where we're at and we're running into the wall, then we're going to destroy the instance. Okay. And well, once we get all this set up, I can show you how this looks. One more thing we want to do here is that the way we want the bullet to function visually is that when the player fires a gun, we want to show a very quick flash, which is that first frame, the first sub-image, frame 0, and then we want to switch from that sub-image to the bullet image, which is frame 1, the second frame. So to pull that off, we're going to make use of the animation end event, which is just what it sounds like. If you have a multi-frame sprite, what animation end event will do is once you've reached the final frame of that animation and the final frame shows on the screen, then this event will be called. And what we want to have occur within that event is we're going to set the speed of our image, meaning the bullet, equal to 0. That will prevent it from animating. And we will set the index of our image to 1, which means it will cause it to sit on the second frame of the image, which is the bullet, by saying image index equals 1. We'll come back to this later. We're going to do a bit more work with it later on, but for now this is what we need at this point. Now that we have the bullet created, let's get our player able to shoot the bullets. So we'll go back into the player object and back into the create event, and let's set up some variables specific to shooting bullets. So comment it as shooting. We're going to do a couple things. One is we want to what are we going to do? One thing we need to do is check how much ammo the player has. We're going to deplete the ammo as they fire their weapon. And another thing we're going to do is introduce a delay so that when they are firing bullets, say by holding down the space bar, we'll put a little momentary pause between each bullet that comes out of the gun so there's not a steady stream of bullets all firing out. For the firing delay, let's just call it firing delay. And we'll initialize it with a value of 0. That will mean that when the player first shoots their gun, it'll work right away. There will be 0 delay. And for remaining ammo, let's be very creative and call it remaining ammo. And we'll set that up to 0. Let's give them some bullets. We'll give them 10. All right? That's all we need for setting up our shooting variables. Come into the step event for our player, and the first thing we want to do is we want to detect if the player has pressed a key that means that they're attempting to fire their gun. So let's create a new custom instance variable. We'll call this one KeyShoot, and then we'll use it to detect if they're pressing whichever key we want to use for shooting. So we'll say keyboard check, and I'm going to use the space bar. All right, and that's it. So remember that if the player presses the spacebar, this will equal 1. If the player is not pressing the spacebar, this will be equal to 0, which is another way of saying true or false. That's all we need to do for that one. In fact, we can close that up. So what are we going to do with that information? Well, there's a bunch of stuff we need to do. One thing is we want to think a little bit about how we want the player to be able to fire off their weapon. And what I want them to be able to do is I want them to be able to fire their weapon if they are standing still. I want them to be able to fire their weapon if they are running around. I even want them to be able to fire their weapon if they are jumping up in the air. So gosh, how in the world are we gonna make how in the world are we gonna make all of that happen? Well, it's a little complicated, all right? So let's create a new region here under animations, and we're gonna assign this new region to shooting. So what are we going to do to pull this off? First of all, I want to have a running clock, essentially, that counts down and decrements the value of the firing delay. This works in a way like our gravity. Gravity, as we've implemented, every step in the game is pulling the player down towards the bottom of the screen, even when they're jumping. Regardless of anything else that's going on, the player is being pulled to the bottom of the screen. We're going to implement firing delay in the same way, in that in every step of the game, we're going to have a firing delay countdown that's just going to keep on counting down. So to do that, I'll say firing delay, and I'm going to subtract 1 from the firing delay. So no matter what else happens, we're going to decrement our firing delay by 1. Now remember, I set it to be 0 here. So when the game starts, it's going to go to -1, -2, and that's fine. We're perfectly content with it going into negative values. Then what I want to do is I want to check if the player is shooting or not. All right. So I'm going to say if, and what did we just set up to detect if they were shooting? We set up something called KeyShoot. So if KeyShoot, meaning if KeyShoot is true, if KeyShoot, they've pressed the firing button, the space bar in this case, is true, and also firing delay is less than 0, meaning that the counter for firing has dropped down to 0 or less, which means they can now fire their weapon, then we'll let them fire. So let's let them fire. How do we do that? Well, first I'm going to say that I'm going to reset the firing delay, and the idea is that I only want to let them fire a weapon every so often, even if they're holding down the space key. Let's put a little pause between bullets coming out. So you can set this to be whatever you like. And the longer, or let's say the bigger this number, the slower the rate of fire. Okay? I'm going to set mine to be 5 for now. Then I need to check if they have any bullets left. So I'll say if remaining ammo equals 0, which means they don't have any bullets left, then I don't want to let them fire. But I would like to give some indication to the player that, sorry, you're out of bullets. So one easy way to do that is to play a sound that sounds like an empty chamber on a gun. So I'll use audio play sound, and the sound that we're going to play is SN click. Set our priority to 10. We don't want it to loop. And then what? Well, if we are in this case, I don't want anything after this to occur. I want to just get out of this thing. So I'm going to use a built-in, it's not even really a function exactly. It's like a command that will tell GameMaker, don't do anything else inside this. So you can see exit statement has a form, exit, it ends the execution of the current script or event. So by putting this exit here, we just drop out of this whole if thing. We'll get rid of the whole thing and just go back to our regular old next round of running the step event. Okay? And we want to do that because we don't want the stuff that comes after this to take place. All right. So let's assume that they, in fact, do have some ammo left. Okay? Then what we can say is remaining ammo, and we want to subtract 1 from that number, so because we're going to let them fire, which means they're going to expend a bullet. Then what we need to do is instantiate an instance of our bullet, exactly what we've done in our Evil Clutches game a whole bunch of times. If you remember how we do that, we say instance create layer, and then we say where do we want to create an instance of our bullet. All right, we have to get a little tricky here. Why do we have to get tricky here? The location at which we place the bullet in relationship to the player, which is where we're doing all of this, is going to be dependent upon whether the player is facing to the right or whether the player is facing to the left. If the player is facing to the right, then we're going to want to move the bullet over to the right in relation to the player. If the player is facing to the left, then we want the bullet to be moved over toward the left of the player. So here's how we can make that happen. We'll take the player's current x coordinate. We'll add to that the sign, our new favorite built-in function that's going to return a 1 if the number is positive and a -1 if the number is negative. So what's the value we're going to use with sign to detect? Well, we'll think about how this works again. We want to move our bullet slightly to the right if we're facing right, slightly to the left if we're facing left. Well, one thing we've used already that we can use again is the player object's image x scale. Remember, we set that as 1 if they're facing right, and we set the x scale to -1 if they're facing to the left. So let's use that. So we can say sign of our player object's image x scale. Now notice here that I am talking to a property, image x scale, that exists on a different object. Well, I guess we are here on this object, so we might be able to get away without using it. I'm being safe here, just to probably overly safe, by directly addressing the player's object's image x scale. So that'll tell us it's either going to be 1 or -1. And then I'm going to take that information and I want to move the object, say, 10 pixels to the right of the x coordinate of our player object, or 10 pixels to the left. So what I can do is to say times 10. So it's either going to be x plus 10 or x minus 10. Then where am I going to position the y coordinate of the bullet? Well, in playing around a little bit with this, I decided it looked pretty good if I took the player's y coordinate and I subtracted 13 from that. The idea is that our player's origin point, if you remember, is right in the middle center of the image. So by taking the y coordinate and subtracting 13, I'm moving the y position of the bullet up a little from the center of the player object, and then with the x coordinate I'm moving it then over left, right or left. Okay. So that will position it in relation to the player object appropriately. Then I need to say which layer do I want to put this bullet instance on. Well, let's go all the way back into our room, and you'll see we've got a collection of layers out in the room, and I'm trying to organize these sort of nicely for the project. So I'm going to create a new instance layer, and I'm going to name this instance layer bullets. And that's where all our bullets will appear, and they're going to appear in front of the player, and then we'll mess with these layers a little later when we want to add our enemies in here. So let's come back out. So the layer where I'm going to instantiate my bullets is going to be the bullets layer. Then what else do I need to do? Well, of course I need to say which object it is I want to instantiate, which is O bullet. See if I've got all my correct settings for this. Let's see. Am I forgetting anything? I think that looks right. I'm looking in the background here to make sure I'm not forgetting anything on this. Nope, that's right. All right, so that will create an instance of the bullet. It'll place it in the right location, and then we're not gonna be able to make things work quite yet. If you remember on the bullet itself, let's come back and take a look at our bullet. On the creative head for the bullet, we're just playing a sound, but we're not actually moving. So we're setting this up a little differently again from what we did when we created or instantiated objects in the Dragon game. And that game, the Evil Clutches game, in the create event for each of the evil babies, health packs, and so on, we actually set the direction and the speed in the create event. Here we're doing it a little differently. We're going to do all of that inside this same old giant step script on our player. So right now, this will create the bullet. It will position it correctly, but the bullet won't move. So to do that, if I want to do it here inside the player, I have to do something slightly tricky. So stick with me here. All right. With the code that we have right now, it will create a bullet. Great. In order to be able to set the speed of the bullet and have the bullet go off in the correct direction, either left or right, from here in the player, I need to do the following. I want to be able to see this a little better than what we're looking at right now. I'm going to expand this out just to give us a little more space. All right, when you use instance create layer to instantiate an instance of an object, this function will return a number, meaning it will do what you say, and then it will create an instance, and that instance that it creates has a unique ID. So what that means is we can use the unique ID for each instance of the bullet, in this case, that's created, and perform some actions on that specific instance through the use of our old friend with, which we've used before when talking about collisions between two objects. If we want to perform some actions on the thing that we've run into, we would say with other, and then we would do some stuff. Okay? So when we said with other, that other was storing the unique identification number of the instance of the object that we ran into. We can accomplish the same concept here by saying with all of this stuff. Like this. With the instance that gets created when we use this function, we want to do something. So since we're going to use with, we can get rid of our little semicolon at the end, put in a pair of squiggly braces, and now we're talking to the instance of the bullet that we just created, and we can do some stuff with it. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to set the speed. And we will set the speed, let's say, to 25. And we need to decide whether the bullet is going to be moving to the left or to the right. And we can do that, well, we can use it a couple different ways, or a few different ways, but we're going to use direction in this case. As we go in to set the direction of our bullet, if you're paying attention closely to this video, you're going to see the size of the text in our script here getting bigger sometimes and smaller sometimes. That's because I'm recording this over multiple sessions, and in fact I'm recording this piece a second time to make sure I fix a visual quirk that we saw in class today. Anyway, all right, so here's how we're going to make this work. First of all, we are now here, because of the width, we're talking to the bullet, right? Not talking to the player. And I want to make sure that our direction for our bullet goes right when the player is facing right and left when the player is facing left. But because we're using this with and are now speaking to the bullet, hi there, it's like we're now living on the copy of the bullet that we created here. I have to be careful when I set up the direction of the bullet to move to recognize that I'm now speaking to the bullet, but I need to know the direction of the player, so I need to sort of talk back to the player. I know that's confusing, but let me type it out and then we'll talk through it. All right. So what I want to know is I want to know which direction the player is facing. So I'm going to talk to the player by saying player dot image x. This should sound familiar, right? Image x scale. And let's start by seeing if the player is facing to the left. So I'll say if the player's image x scale is less than 0, that means that we set it to -1 somewhere because they were facing to the left, so that means they're facing to the left. So what I want to do in that case is set the direction equal to 180, which is the direction when you're facing straight to the left. Now, this is confusing, right? Because here we're talking to the player, but here we're just saying direction. But because we're within this width, and the width is pointing to the copy of the bullet, this direction is going to set the direction of the bullet to move. There's one more thing we need to do. We're setting the direction of the bullet to move right now, which means it'll move to the left at a speed of 25 pixels per step. But if we go back to the sprite for our bullet and look at this frame, you'll see that we've got we've defined a front of the bullet, which is this white part of the bullet image. So in addition to setting the direction we want the bullet to move, we also, like we did with the player sprite, we need to make sure that we are pointing the bullet to the left, the image of the bullet. So to do that, we can again use image x scale equals -1. So I know I'm beating a dead horse with this, going on and on about it, but it's really important to understand what's happening here. Inside this if statement, we are talking to each copy we create of a bullet, and we're setting that bullet's copy's direction and that bullet copy's image x scale. Within the if here, we are talking back to the player by explicitly saying, hey player, is your image x scale less than 0? And if so, then set the bullet copy direction and image x scale to these values. All right. Because we're just talking to one copy of the bullet, we may only need to check if its image x scale is less than 0 and not do the other part. Okay? Let's run it and see what happens. Here's our player. He fires the bullet correctly. Let's look over this way. And he fires the bullet correctly, and even the little image is firing the right way. Sweet. All right, that works.